Mother arrested for bread and milk. The judge never expected what her daughters did. A desperate mother left home to get food for her daughters. What seemed like a simple act ended with her handcuffed in front of a courtroom. But no one could have imagined that it would be her two little girls, just 14 and 3 years old, who would change the course of the story with words that moved everyone present. Subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. In that tiny one-bedroom apartment, the peeling walls and worn-out carpet no longer hid the harshness of the life this mother and her daughters endured. The woman in her 30s woke early and stood for a few minutes staring at the almost empty fridge. Inside sat a bruised apple, 2 moldy slices of bread, and the last of some spoiled milk. Her stomach tightened, but not out of hunger for herself. She was thinking of her 3-year-old who had just woken up and would soon be asking for something sweet, and of her 14-year-old who tried not to show weakness but felt the emptiness. All the same, the mother took a deep breath, tied her hair back with a worn-out elastic band, and whispered that she was going out. She asked her eldest to watch her little sister, to keep the door locked and not to open it for anyone. On the table, she left a few coins she had. Not enough for a proper meal, but at least enough to cover the bus fare. The glance she exchanged with her oldest daughter needed no words. There was trust, but also a quiet fear burning beneath the surface. The teenager nodded, already used to shouldering responsibilities far greater than her age should have allowed. With her little sister in her arms, she tried to distract the child with a drawing scribbled in an old notebook with yellowed pages. The little one asked if their mother would be back soon, and the teenager said yes, promising she'd bring bread, and maybe even a little milk, though inside she feared it wouldn't be that simple. Their mother put on a plain blouse, slipped her tired feet into worn shoes that already left them sore, and draped her coat over her arm to appear more put together than she felt. Before leaving, she kissed both girls on the head and forced a smile, hiding tears that threatened to fall. She went down the narrow stairwell, crossed the courtyard where abandoned shopping carts sat, and walked to the bus stop. The cold morning wind hit her face, and every street corner seemed to remind her that the city left no room for mistakes, especially for someone already living on the edge. The bus rattled along crowded streets, filled with workers in uniforms and sleepy students. She sat by the window, watching bakeries with stocked shelves, cafes bustling with customers, and restaurants showing off elaborate dishes, all far beyond her reach. When she arrived at the neighborhood grocery store, she took a deep breath before walking through the automatic doors. The smell of fresh bread hit her immediately, and her heart tightened at the thought of her daughters waiting at home. Down the aisle of basic goods, she picked up a small loaf of bread, half a gallon of milk, some bananas, and oatmeal. Each item was chosen carefully, as if she were calculating not only the cost, but also how many hours of fullness they might give her daughters. At the register, she handed over her prepaid card. The sharp beep announced the decline. She tried again, clinging to hope. Declined again. The cashier sighed impatiently. The customers behind her huffed, and the clock on the wall seemed to speed up. She asked to keep just the milk and bread, the most urgent items. The card was declined once more. The coins in her pocket didn't even make up half the total. Her heart raced, and her eyes filled with tears as she imagined her little girl asking for milk that afternoon. With trembling hands, she clutched the items to her chest, told the cashier she would come back to pay, and hurried toward the exit. The automatic doors slid open, and for a moment, it seemed she might actually get away. But a security guard appeared at her side, blocking the way. He asked her to stop. His face wasn't angry, but it was the face of someone used to dealing with situations like this. Still, Every curious glance around her burned like judgment. The manager was called over and, in front of everyone, asked if she understood she was committing a crime. The mother said yes, but that she had no choice. She explained it was just for two hungry daughters at home. None of it stopped the protocol. Led into the glass office near the registers. She sat at a table stained with old coffee rings. The guard folded his arms, and the manager picked up the phone to call the police. The mother tried to explain, but her words came out broken by sobs. She begged to write a note to leave at home, just so her girls wouldn't be scared when she didn't return. The manager refused, saying it wasn't allowed. She then asked to use the phone, but her prepaid plan had no credit to complete a call. The guard's radio crackled with the message that the patrol car was on its way. Her heart thudded unevenly, and the only thought running through her mind was, who's looking after the little one right now? She pictured her eldest trying to calm her sister, making up excuses, hugging her tightly to hide her own fear. For the first time, she realized she wouldn't be able to keep her promise to return quickly. When the police arrived, there was no argument. Two officers walked in, recited her rights in a flat tone, and closed the cold handcuffs around her wrists. Shoppers gathered to watch, some whispering, others raising their phones to record. She walked down the store's central aisle with her head lowered, each step heavier than the last. The automatic doors slid open again, but this time there was no freedom on the other side, only the patrol car waiting outside. Inside the vehicle, the tears she'd held back finally fell. Through the window, she saw rows of rooftops, busy streets, people carrying bags full of groceries, and wondered how she could ever explain to two little girls that the world could be this cruel. The silence of the siren didn't lessen the noise of her anguish. As the car pulled away, she repeated her daughter's names over and over in her mind, as if that could form an invisible shield against the pain that was only beginning to deepen. In the small apartment, the kitchen clock seemed to tick painfully slow for the 14-year-old girl. She sat on the torn sofa with her little sister on her lap, trying to invent a game to pass the time, but each minute made the silence heavier. The old television barely worked, full of static, and the notebook of drawings was already covered with colored scribbles that no longer distracted the child. Outside the window, neighbors walked by with quick conversations, carrying shopping bags filled with food, and each glimpse of groceries only reminded the teenager why her mother had left. When the little one asked if their mother was coming back soon, the older sister squeezed her hand and said yes, forcing a smile that didn't convince even herself. The lingering smell of gas from the stove, the echo of the hallway, and the distant sound of sirens all blended into an atmosphere of anxiety that seemed endless. The younger girl slipped off her lap and ran to the door, calling for their mother as if she might appear any second. The teenager rushed over, pulled her back, and tried to calm her with promises that she would return soon, maybe even with a bag of fresh bread. But her words felt hollow. Then a knock on the doorframe echoed through the apartment. A curious neighbor, arms crossed, spoke loudly enough for others to hear. Your mother was arrested at the store stealing food. Everyone's already talking about it. The teenager froze. Her blood ran cold, her heart pounded, and for a few seconds she couldn't move her lips to respond. The little one looked at her sister, confused, and asked what prison meant. Why? The neighbor was calling their mother a criminal. The older sister slammed the door shut, locked it twice, and leaned her back against the wood, breathing deeply to keep from falling apart. In the living room, she hugged her little sister and rocked her slowly, as if she were still a baby, even though she was already 3 years old. She wanted to protect her from the weight of those words. But the little one, curious, kept asking questions. Why the man mentioned the police? Why their mom wasn't back yet? Why neighbors whispered in the hallway? The teenager decided she couldn't tell her everything, but she couldn't lie either. She simply said that their mother had run into some trouble, but she was strong and would come back. Deep inside, though, she wasn't sure she believed it. The sound of her sister's muffled sobs filled the room, mixing with the wind rattling against the window. The teenager felt the crushing responsibility pressing on her. Being a mother, sister, friend, protector all at once, while her own childhood slipped further away. The apartment felt smaller with every passing minute. Every corner reminded her of their mother's absence. The empty chair at the table, the coat left hanging by the door, the hairbrush still wet in the bathroom. The teenager noticed these details as if they were proof she would return, but at the same time, each one reinforced the fear that maybe she wouldn't. The little one grabbed the bruised apple from the fridge and took a bite, grimacing at the sour taste. Her sister quickly took it away, threw it out, and tried to improvise a glass of water mixed with sugar to ease the hunger. It didn't taste good, but it was enough to quiet their empty stomachs. She promised that once their mother was back, everything would be fine. The little one only whispered if their mom would be upset that they'd eaten without her. The teenager's heart tightened even more. A few minutes later, two neighbors gossiped loudly in the hallway, not caring that the girls could hear. They said their mother had been taken to court that very afternoon, that local papers already knew, and the story would spread quickly. The teenager held her breath, trying to process what she'd just heard. Court. Trial. That meant their mother wouldn't be coming home anytime soon. She looked over at her sister, now playing with a faded rag doll, and realized she had to act. Waiting wasn't enough. She grabbed her school backpack, stuffed a jacket for each of them inside, slipped coins into her pocket, and decided they would go to the courthouse. When her sister asked where they were going, she answered firmly, to bring Mom back. The decision was made. The teenager dressed her sister in a light blouse and slipped her feet into worn shoes that were still too big. She put on her own thin jacket and gripped the little one's hand tightly. The younger child didn't fully understand, only asking if they would see their mom soon, if she would come back home with them. With each evasive answer, the teenager felt her throat tighten. They went down the building stairs, passing neighbors who looked at them with pity or judgment. Outside, the air was cold, the wind stinging their young faces. The teenager knew only one thing. She needed to be there in front of the judge, to say their mother wasn't a criminal, that she had done everything for them, that all she wanted was to feed her daughters. And even with fear pounding in her chest, she squeezed her sister's hand tighter and walked with determination toward the courthouse. The city courthouse stood just a few blocks from downtown, its imposing facade with worn columns and a flag fluttering high above. For the teenager, every step toward it felt longer than an entire race, because she carried not only her own uncertainty, but also the small, sweaty hand of her 3-year-old sister, who kept asking at every corner if they were there yet. The morning chill still lingered, and her thin jacket was no match for the cutting wind, but determination kept them moving forward. People rushed past, some stopping to stare, others hurrying on without concern, though the curious glances didn't escape the older girl. When they reached the courthouse steps, her heart raced at the sight of the commotion. Reporters adjusting cameras, bystanders talking loudly, security officers guiding lines. For the first time, she realized her mother's problem wasn't just theirs. It had already become a public matter. The teenager carefully pulled her sister along and slipped in through the side door, carried by the current of people. The hallway smelled of old paper, stale coffee, and dusty carpet, all blending with the sound of footsteps echoing against the high walls. As they neared the main chamber, they saw silent signs, uniformed guards, and lawyers balancing piles of documents. The 3-year-old clutched her worn-out doll against her chest, her face streaked with dried tears, asking if their mother was really inside. The older sister nodded and squeezed her hand, too afraid to answer out loud. Inside, waves of anxiety grew because she herself didn't know if they'd be allowed to see their mother or be turned away. At the courtroom door, a guard eyed them strangely, but, noticing their age and the pleading look in the teenager's eyes, let them in, perhaps moved by the fragile scene before him. The room was crowded. Rows were filled with people whispering, some holding up phones, others simply watching as if it were a show. At the back, the judge sat on the elevated bench shuffling papers, and in front of him stood the chair for the accused. That was when the teenager saw her mother, sitting there in handcuffs, wearing the same worn blouse she'd left home in, her hair tied hastily, eyes swollen from crying. The mother lifted her head instinctively, and when she recognized her daughters, her expression shifted from pain to despair. The teenager tightened her grip on her little sister's hand and led her to a bench nearby, trying to appear strong, though inside she wanted to run and hug her. The little one, unfiltered, shouted, "Mommy!" The sound pierced the formality of the room, drawing looks of disapproval from some and compassion from others. Whispers spread. Journalists scribbled notes. Cameras swung around, and suddenly the girls had become part of the spectacle. Their mother, tears streaming down her face, tried to gesture discreetly with her head, urging them to stay calm, but the toddler's crying only grew louder. The teenager scooped her up, sat firmly, and rocked her gently, whispering that they'd be with their mother soon. But each word made her heart pound harder because she wasn't sure it was true. From the defendant's chair, their mother never took her eyes off them, as if each second was a desperate attempt to send love across the distance. The judge struck his gavel, calling for order, warning that interruptions wouldn't be tolerated. But no one could erase the image of a small child crying out for her handcuffed mother. As the room slowly settled, the teenager scanned the crowd. Some snickered quietly at the commotion. Others shook their heads in disapproval. But there were also tearful faces, especially among older women who seemed to understand the pain. Lawyers whispered to one another, shuffling papers, one remarking that the scene would make headlines by evening. The judge straightened his robe and began reading the case aloud. Theft of basic food items from a local grocery store. The words, cold and technical, landed like stones on the teenager's heart. It was as if their entire life, full of countless details, had been reduced to a dry sentence in a file. The little one, not understanding any of it, leaned her head on her sister's shoulder and sucked her thumb for comfort, while the older girl forced herself to listen to every word from the judge. The gavel fell again, officially starting the proceedings. To the teenager, it all felt like a cruel play in which her mother had been forced to perform. She glanced again at her, who was taking deep breaths and squeezing her cuffed hands together, trying to stay strong. The judge asked if there were any witnesses or representatives, and the girl's stomach twisted. Could she speak herself? She didn't yet know how, or if she would find the courage, but she already understood that if no one defended her mother, it would be up to her. At that moment, their eyes met. Mother and 14-year-old daughter. No words were spoken, but a silent pact was made. The courtroom, crowded and noisy, didn't seem to notice. But in that corner of the room grew the certainty that those girls would not stay silent in the face of injustice. The atmosphere seemed to breathe with a strange tension as the judge adjusted his robe and leaned into the microphone, calling for complete silence. The whispers faded gradually, but the weight of collective judgment hung in the air like an unavoidable shadow. The mother, still in handcuffs, kept her eyes locked on her daughters in the front row, as if simply seeing them was the only anchor keeping her from falling apart. The teenager, her hands clasped tightly with her younger sister's, realized the whole room was watching them with curiosity. Journalists prepared their notes. Some cameras discreetly recorded every reaction, and the lawyers, cold and detached, flipped through papers without looking at anyone but the judge. The 3-year-old tried to stand on the bench to get a better view of her mother, but her older sister held her close, afraid another outburst would be seen as disorder. The air conditioning chilled the room even more, and with every passing minute, the distance between innocence and condemnation seemed to grow wider. Then the judge began to speak about the case. His voice carried an irony that felt cruel in the moment. He said the matter was simple: the theft of a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a few low-value items, but still a crime, and the law could not be treated as a joke. Some in the audience chuckled quietly, as if it were funny to see someone's life reduced to a grocery list. The mother's face burned with shame, and she lowered her head. The teenager felt her blood boil hearing laughter as her mother was labeled a criminal. She looked around and saw a man shaking his head in disapproval, while a woman stifled a laugh behind her hand. The judge paused and repeated that this was not about lacking humanity, but about preserving social order. Those words weighed down even more heavily on the mother's dignity, keeping her from raising her eyes. Sensing the discomfort, the little one began to cry softly, clutching her rag doll against her chest. The teenager tried to soothe her, but between sobs, she kept repeating that she wanted her mom home. The sound of her crying echoed through the courtroom, forcing everyone to hear what they had managed to ignore. The judge, irritated, struck his gavel and demanded silence, but the cries persisted. By then, few were laughing anymore. The child's tears exposed the absurdity of the scene: a little girl asking for her mother, while adults debated whether she belonged in handcuffs. The teenager held her sister close, looking straight at the judge, as if daring him to silence such an undeniable truth. Their mother, watching, let a tear slip, and for the first time, raised her eyes to the man in the robe, silently pleading for humanity. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain control. He said he understood the situation, but the law could not bend to emotion. He added that if everyone who went hungry decided to steal, there would be chaos, and an example had to be set. His harsh words cut through the air like blades. The teenager squeezed her sister's hand, fighting the urge to stand, but stayed seated, afraid they might be thrown out. The audience, once entertained, now seemed divided. Some agreed with the severe tone, but others murmured that this might be going too far. The mood was shifting slowly, and the presence of the girls, especially the youngest, made it impossible to treat the case as just another crime. Journalists scribbled furiously, capturing every detail that could become a headline, while the judge shifted uncomfortably under the flashes starting to light up the room. At last, the mother was given the chance to speak. Her voice shook, but it was steady enough to be heard. She said she never wanted to steal, but she had always looked for work. But that morning she couldn't stand to see her daughters go hungry again. She explained she had tried everything, but there was no one left to turn to. Her words weren't long or rehearsed, but they carried a sincerity that silenced even the skeptics. The judge interrupted, asking her to be brief, but at that moment the teenager felt the urge to stand. She looked at her little sister, who stared back with tearful eyes, and realized she might be the only one left to say what their lives were really like. Her heart raced, but courage began to form. Before the judge could move on, the teenager slowly stood, still holding her little sister in her arms, and asked to speak. The room erupted in murmurs. Some thought it improper, others fell silent. Waiting, the judge hesitated, but faced with the girl's insistent gaze, he allowed it. With a trembling voice, the teenager said their mother had always done everything for them, that she stayed up late trying to find work, that she shared her own plate so her daughters could eat, and that she had only left home that morning because she couldn't bear to hear the little one cry from hunger anymore. At those words, the toddler reached out her arms toward her mother and cried, between sobs, "Mommy, come home. I want you with me." the room fell into absolute silence. The judge lost his lofty posture and simply raised his hand for order. But no one there could ignore the moment anymore. The entire courtroom felt that something much larger was unfolding before their eyes. The judge settled back into his chair with an air of superiority, as if the teenager's emotional plea had been nothing more than a trivial detail beneath the weight of the law. His hand, still raised for silence, lingered in the air before, finally dropping, and when it did, his lips curved into a sarcastic smile that clashed with the gravity of the scene. He glanced at the papers before him, shook his head, and remarked aloud that he had seen many similar cases, all full of emotional excuses. But the courtroom was not a place for childish dramatics. Part of the audience let out nervous laughter, following his irony, while others averted their eyes, uncomfortable with the scorn in his tone. The teenager, still standing, felt her face burn and pulled her sister tightly against her chest, as if shielding her not just from the situation, but from the cruelty of the man in charge. Their mother lowered her eyes again, unable to watch. As tears slid silently down her cheeks, the judge continued, saying it was regrettable that children were being dragged into a legal proceeding, claiming their presence only disrupted the process and proved the mother's irresponsibility. At those words, the little one burst into loud sobs, calling for her mother again and again, her cries echoing through the courtroom. The judge slammed his gavel several times, demanding order, but each strike sounded like an attempt to crush a pain that couldn't be silenced. The teenager whispered into her sister's ear, urging her to calm down, then looked up at the judge with an unexpected firmness, as though daring him to ridicule them further. The audience, once scattered in attention, now watched with growing intensity, recognizing how starkly the coldness of authority contrasted with the raw fragility of the girls before them. Whispers began to ripple through the rows, and soon an older woman murmured that this had gone too far, that mocking children was beyond cruel. A reporter, keenly observant, scribbled down every word the judge uttered, sensing they would spark controversial headlines. A man in the back shook his head in outrage, while another voice muttered that this wasn't justice, but public humiliation. Their mother, chained to the defendant's bench, clenched and unclenched her cuffed hands, trying to suppress her anxiety, though her eyes fixed on her daughters betrayed her terror of losing them forever. The judge ignored the murmurs, doubling down, declaring that the law must be respected, that emotions did not pay bills and tears did not erase crimes. Yet with every cold word, the room seemed to drift further from him and closer to the family, as if the people had already chosen their side. The teenager could no longer stay seated. Though trembling inside, she lifted her little sister into her arms, turned to face the audience, and spoke in a steady voice. She said their mother was not a criminal, that she stayed up late at night trying to care for them, that the only reason she made a mistake was because she had no other way left. Her voice cracked with emotion, but her words were clear enough to fill the entire room. The judge raised his eyebrows, surprised by her boldness, then sneered that perhaps he should list the girl as a future defense attorney. His comment drew a few nervous chuckles, but it could not mask the real impact her words carried. The little one, tears streaming down her cheeks, stretched her arms out toward her mother again, begging her to come home. The sound of her sobs shattered any attempt at levity in the room. At that moment, the audience divided more sharply. Some still laughed, entertained by the judge's cynicism, but most remained in heavy silence, moved by the sight of the children. A woman in the corner dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, while a young man muttered that it was wrong to brand a woman a criminal, when all she wanted was bread and milk for her daughters. Journalists captured every reaction, every tear, every word, and it became clear that this hearing was no longer just a routine case. It was turning into something that could resonate far beyond those walls. The judge, realizing he was losing, the room, tried to recover his authority, repeating that the courtroom was not a stage for melodrama. But his words already sounded hollow, drowned out by the image of a mother in chains and her daughter's desperate pleas. The teenager sat back down, still clutching her sister, but now with a different fire in her eyes. It was no longer just fear. It was the steady rise of determination that she would not let her mother be crushed by words of contempt. The judge called for order once more, striking his gavel, but his control over the room was slipping. The audience buzzed with a mix of outrage and compassion, and the presence of the press guaranteed that every detail would echo beyond the courthouse. Their mother, her eyes glistening, looked at her daughters and drew in a deep breath, perhaps feeling that she was no longer alone in the fight. And even as the judge clung to his sarcasm and repeated the law like a shield, the seed of compassion had already been planted in the hearts of those present, ready to grow in a way he could no longer contain. The judge straightened the papers in front of him and, with a heavy sigh, said it was time to hear from the defendant. The room fell silent, every eye turning to the woman in simple clothes, her wrists bound, her face lined with exhaustion. The mother drew in a breath, her hands trembling, though inside her a hidden strength rose, fueled by the gaze of her daughters. The teenager, still holding her little sister tightly, leaned forward as if trying to catch every word her mother might say. The 3-year-old, eyes wet, sucked her thumb, not fully understanding, but sensing the weight of the moment. The audience, divided between criticism and compassion, leaned in expectantly. And when the mother opened her mouth, there was no rehearsed speech, only the raw truth of someone who had nothing left to lose but her dignity. "I never wanted to be here," she began, her voice hoarse but steady. She told them she had searched for jobs everywhere, from cleaning to temporary shifts, but was always turned away. She explained she was raising 2 daughters alone with no help, and many times went without food herself so the girls wouldn't go to bed hungry. She recalled nights when the eldest pretended to be full, just so the little one could have another spoonful. She said she had tried everything before going to the store, but that morning, faced with an empty fridge and her daughters begging for milk, she couldn't bear it any longer. Her words carried no anger, no calculated defense, only a pain so genuine it silenced the whispers in the room. The judge tried to keep a rigid expression, but the eyes of several in the crowd were already brimming with tears. She looked at her daughters and, for the first time in a long while, managed to hold their gaze without bowing her head. "I failed them," she said, "not because I stole, but because I couldn't give them what they needed without reaching this point." The teenager swallowed hard, fighting back tears, while the little one whispered softly, "Mommy," as if it were a prayer. The mother said she had never wanted to feel shame, never wanted to be news. But at that moment she only wished they would understand. She hadn't stolen out of greed, nor addiction. She had stolen because 2 innocent girls depended on her. Her words came slowly, broken by the lump in her throat, but that only heightened their impact, because everyone felt it. There was no performance here. Only life lay bare in its harshest form, dot at the back of the room. An elderly woman dabbed her tears with a floral handkerchief, while a man in a suit muttered that he had never imagined such humiliation over so little. A reporter typed furiously, already drafting the headlines that would appear before nightfall. A guard in the corner pressed his jaw tight, as if trying to keep his own emotions contained. With each word, the mood shifted. The weight of earlier laughter dissipated, replaced by an unease that spread through the crowd. The judge cleared his throat, trying to cut her off, saying he had heard enough, but she raised her voice with a threat of courage no one expected. She said she wasn't asking for pity for herself, but justice for her daughters, because they didn't deserve to go hungry for the failures of a system that closed every door. That moment filled the teenager with a mix of pride and pain, seeing in her mother not just fragility, but a courage she had never noticed before. The little one, not fully grasping the weight of it all, stood on the bench and said clearly through her sobs, "I just want mommy to come home." The silence that followed was immediate and sharp. The judge lifted his hand, calling for order, but the room was no longer his. Every gaze was fixed on that broken family, and the child's words echoed louder than any gavel. The mother, fighting back tears, gave her daughter a smile with her eyes, and that alone was enough to bring more people to tears. The teenager, seeing her sister unable to stop crying, held her close and whispered, "She's always done everything for us." The whole courtroom seemed to hold its breath, because it was impossible not to feel the human weight of that image. A mother in chains, a teenager forced to act grown, and a child begging for her home. The judge struck his gavel again, repeating order, order in the court, but his voice had lost its authority. The mother fell silent, drained, but she had achieved what she needed. She had turned her pain into a voice, her shame into testimony. The audience was still divided, but the emotion was undeniable, written even on the faces of those who had laughed earlier. Some whispered that she couldn't be condemned. Others wondered what they would do in her place. The journalist noted every detail, aware that the story was about to grow far beyond those walls. The mother lowered her eyes again, not in defeat, but because she knew she had already said all that mattered. Her daughters, sitting together in the front row, never looked away from her, as if no one else existed in the room. And in that instant, the entire courtroom understood that this was no ordinary trial. It was a cry for survival. After the mother's final words, the silence that filled the courtroom was no longer heavy and hostile, but charged with expectation. The teenager sat firm with her little sister in her arms, her eyes fixed on their handcuffed mother as if trying to transmit every ounce of strength she had. The judge, unsettled, adjusted his glasses and repeated that the law was clear. That emotion could not replace order, but his words rang emptier with every sentence in the face of what everyone had just witnessed. Then, without warning, an elderly woman with white hair and a floral handkerchief stood up from the middle row. Her voice trembled but carried resolve as she said she, too, had once been a single mother and knew what it meant to hear children cry from hunger. The room turned toward her, and the tears streaming down her face carried more weight than any legal argument. The judge struck his gavel, demanding silence, but he could not contain the force of her words. Moments later, a middle-aged man in a faded military cap rose from the back and walked forward with steady steps. He introduced himself as a war veteran and told how he had known hunger firsthand, how he had watched comrades die in trenches without so much as a scrap of bread, and how, to him, seeing a mother in chains for trying to feed 2 children was a greater disgrace than any enemy he had ever faced. He said loudly that if the problem was work, he himself would help her get a job at the warehouse where he worked, with wages and dignity guaranteed. The audience reacted with murmurs of approval, some even clapping softly, and the cold wall of formality began to crumble under the weight of solidarity. The voices multiplied quickly. A shopkeeper stood and declared he would hire her to clean his store 3 times a week. A woman, owner of a small restaurant, promised the girls would never go hungry again, offering them meals whenever they needed. Another young woman, wearing a badge that identified her as a social worker, pledged to personally follow the case and enroll the family in assistance programs. Each offer spread like fire through the crowd, igniting collective compassion until the entire courtroom was filled with voices defending the mother. The judge tried to speak, but he was drowned out by spontaneous testimonies. Journalists recorded every word, every gesture, aware that this hearing was no longer an ordinary case. It had become a living symbol of humanity standing against the coldness of the law. At the defendant's bench, the mother wept silently, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her daughters, in the front row, pressed close to her whenever the guards allowed, brief touches made possible by the sheer force of the crowd's emotion. The little one sobbed loudly, begging her mother not to leave while the teenager stroked her hair, whispering that everything would be fine now. Around them, people drew closer, discreetly offering cards, addresses, and small slips of paper with job contacts. A man even pulled a crumpled bill from his pocket and handed it to a guard to pass along to the family. For those few minutes, the line between accused and public disappeared, replaced by a collective urge to make things right. The judge watched, more uncomfortable by the second, realizing he no longer controlled the scene. Losing patience, the judge stood, ordering silence, and declared the court would recess for 10 minutes. He said he needed time to reflect on the confusion that had overtaken the hearing and ordered no one to leave the room. His gavel struck hard, but it did little to quiet the murmurs. As soon as he stepped through the side door, the tension dissolved into motion. The teenager rushed to her mother, pulling her sister by the hand, and the three embraced tightly. The chains no barrier to their desperate reunion. People around them whispered, some took photos, others cried, and journalists captured every detail with lenses that sought not only images, but the raw emotion of the moment. For the mother, that embrace was the only certainty left. Even if the world turned against her, she still had her daughters, and now an entire room unwilling to let the word criminal define her. When the 10 minutes passed, the door opened again, and the judge returned. His expression changed, less arrogant, weighed down. He sat, drew in a deep breath, and called for silence. This time met not by fear, but by expectation. He said he had listened carefully to every statement and had never seen anything like it in his career. He explained that, technically, theft could not be ignored, but that it would be senseless to condemn a woman who now had concrete job offers and community support. He looked at the mother and said, "I am giving you this chance. Never do this again. Prove that everyone who spoke today was right to trust you." For a moment, the room stayed in silence, then erupted in applause. The teenager hugged her sister. Their mother wept openly, and even a few guards smiled discreetly. The courtroom, once a stage of humiliation, had turned in that instant into a place of hope. The echo of the gavel still lingered when the judge declared the hearing closed. The room, divided just moments earlier, was now united in a hushed emotional calm. The guards approached the mother with slow movements, and for the first time during the entire session, there was no rush or harshness in their gestures. One of them, his expression serious yet softened by humanity, asked her to stand. She obeyed, her legs trembling, and felt the cold weight of metal as the key turned in the cuffs. The sharp click marked the end of a prison that had weighed more heavily in shame than in steel. As soon as her wrists were free, she rubbed them instinctively, not out of pain, but to confirm that she was truly released. Her daughters, seated at the front, followed every movement with unblinking eyes, and the younger one, without waiting for permission, ran straight into her mother's arms. The reunion was immediate and overwhelming. The little one clung to her mother's neck, sobbing that she never wanted her to leave again. The teenager, more restrained but equally shaken, gripped her mother's arm tightly, as if she needed the physical assurance that they were together once more. The audience watched in silence, though the air was thick with stifled tears and heavy breaths. The mother, still trembling, kissed the small girl's head, then placed her hand on her eldest shoulder and whispered a soft, "Thank you." It escaped more as a sob than as a word. At that moment, there were no guards, no rigid protocols, no courtroom barriers, only a family, scarred but unbroken. And that made the scene greater than any sentence could ever be. Some in the audience could no longer resist and began to clap. At first hesitant, almost embarrassed, the applause grew stronger, spreading like a wave until it filled the entire room. The judge, still seated, did not intervene. He simply watched, perhaps aware that he no longer had the power to stop a collective gesture. Journalists seized the moment, raising cameras and recorders, capturing every tear, every embrace, every detail that conveyed the weight of what had just unfolded. An elderly woman wept openly, dabbing her eyes with the same floral handkerchief from before. The veteran stood tall, cap in hand, as though saluting something greater than any flag. The words spoken only minutes earlier had now materialized in that image, proof that there is no shame in fighting for food when the fight is for your children's survival. One of the guards, visibly moved, guided the family to remain together. As he cleared a path through the crowd, the teenager lifted her sister into her arms, helped by their mother, who was still shaking from tears, but never let go of their hands for even a second. The hallway leading out of the courtroom felt longer than it had on the way in, but this time they didn't walk in silence. They were accompanied by gazes of respect and compassion. People reached out to gently touch the mother's shoulder, as if to pass strength to her. Others slipped her hurried notes, some with job addresses, others with phone numbers to call. Every step toward the exit was living proof that, even though the law had tried to brand the family with ridicule, the humanity in that room had built them a bridge back. Outside the courtroom, camera flashes nearly blinded the mother, but the teenager stepped in front of her instinctively, a natural shield. Reporters shouted questions, but no microphone could break the fragile bubble that formed around the family. The little one, still crying and exhausted, begged to go home, and the mother rocked her as best she could in the middle of the chaos. The veteran approached discreetly, not seeking attention, and placed in her hands a bag of fresh bread and a bottle of milk. He simply said, no one deserved to go through what they had. The mother met his eyes with silent gratitude, and he, without lingering, adjusted his cap and stepped back. That small gesture carried the strength of a promise. They would not be left to face hunger alone again. Beyond the doors, the day was already fading, the sky painted orange. The mother took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and felt the cold wind on her face as though it were the first time in years she could breathe without fear. Her daughters, one on each side, squeezed her hands, forming a bond no judge, no chains, no cruel laughter could break. Around them, the crowd that had followed the hearing continued to murmur, some filming on their phones, others simply watching. But inside that small circle of love, there was no audience, no judge, no headline. There was only a family that, though shamed and humiliated, now walked out with their heads held high, dignity restored by the arms entwined around each other. And in that moment, what mattered was not the shame of the past, but the certainty that they would never again face the world alone. The next morning, the case was already in every local newspaper. Headlines read, "Mother on trial for trying to feed her daughters," and "Courtroom moved by children defending their mother." Photographs captured the embrace, the 3-year-old reaching out her arms, and the teenager's serious expression as she protected her sister. Television channels replayed the footage on a loop, while commentators debated the boundary between law and humanity. The mother, still shaken, sat on the edge of her bed with her daughters on either side, watching the reports. It felt strange to see her pain broadcast nationwide, but alongside the discomfort came an unexpected sense of relief. Now no one could claim ignorance of what they had endured. The teenager read passages from the newspaper aloud, especially the ones praising her courage, while the little one swung her legs, distracted by her worn-out doll. There was a knock at the door early that morning. When the teenager opened it, she found neighbors who had rarely exchanged words with them before, now holding bags of groceries, rice, pasta, fruit, and fresh bread. Some had even left anonymous envelopes at the door with folded bills inside. The mother, overwhelmed, thanked them tearfully, repeating that she didn't know how to repay such kindness. An older neighbor brought children's clothes saved from her grandchildren's days, and the teenager helped sort through them to see what would fit her younger sister. In the hallway, people whispered that they had all seen the news, that they were ashamed for not having helped earlier, and that from now on, things would be different. The little one darted around the apartment, delighted with the bags of food, asking if they could eat everything at once. Her mother laughed softly and told her they could finally wait for dinner without fear of having nothing to serve. That afternoon brought an unexpected visit. The veteran appeared again, in his same worn military cap, carrying a bag in each hand. Inside were simple toys, a colorful ball, a teddy bear, and a picture book. The little girl's eyes widened, and she rushed to snatch the bear, clutching it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The man smiled, adjusted his cap, and said this was only the beginning, that he would make sure there were no more empty smiles in that home. The mother, touched, tried to offer him coffee, but he politely declined, saying he would stop by another day, preferring to leave that moment just for them. Before leaving, he rested his hand on the teenager's shoulder and told her, "You're stronger than many I knew on the battlefield." The girl, unsure how to respond, simply lowered her eyes, but tucked the words away like an invisible medal. Throughout the week, more visitors came. The shopkeeper who had promised her a job returned with a formal offer for the mother to work in his store several days a week, and he even recommended her to another place for extra shifts. The restaurant owner sent over hot meals through a delivery boy, and the social worker visited with forms to fill out, ensuring they would receive benefits. The apartment, once empty and silent, began to fill with life. Friendly voices, laughter, the smell of food, and improvised furniture brought by supportive neighbors. The teenager helped organize every donation, while the little one scattered her toys across the floor, turning the living room into a space that finally felt like it belonged to children. The mother, watching it all, still struggled to believe. But each gesture was like a brick rebuilding the dignity that had been shattered in court. The girls felt the difference in their routines as well. The teenager returned to school without carrying the same weight on her shoulders, knowing her mother wasn't fighting alone anymore. Teachers quietly congratulated her, and classmates mentioned seeing her on TV, though she brushed off their comments, choosing not to bask in attention. The little one, with her new toys, ran through the apartment giggling, something she hadn't done in a long time. Their mother, though still weary, seemed to breathe more easily. The dark circles under her eyes remained, but something new had appeared in her gaze: hope. That hope was nurtured daily by neighbors who now knocked on the door, not to gossip, but to ask if they needed anything, as if the courtroom had awakened the entire community's conscience. At night, after the little one had fallen asleep with the veteran's teddy bear in her arms, the mother sat with the teenager at the small kitchen table. The dim lamplight spread over the social workers' forms and the slips of paper with contact numbers. The mother sighed, admitting she still didn't know how to thank people for so much kindness. Her daughter replied that there was no need to thank anyone, that people were only making up for what they had failed to do before. They looked at each other in silence, both understanding there was still a long road ahead, but it would no longer be a lonely one. That night, unlike so many others, they did not fall asleep fearing an empty fridge, but with the sense that finally, the world no longer saw them as invisible. The weeks that followed brought changes that might have seemed small to outsiders, but to that family, they were monumental. The refrigerator, once empty, now held color. Bottles of milk, fresh fruit, a modest piece of cheese, even vegetables the mother carefully chopped to stretch into more meals. The kitchen cabinets stored bags of rice, pasta, and flour, all thanks to donations and the first paycheck from her new job. When the teenager opened the fridge in the morning, she no longer felt that knot in her chest that had haunted her daily. Now she knew her mother had something solid to lean on. The little one, excited, ran through the living room with her teddy bear in her arms, inventing stories out loud, filling the space with laughter that hadn't been heard there in far too long. Their small, cramped apartment finally felt like a real home. The mother now held steady in her job. It was no longer new to wake early, catch the bus, and spend the day among boxes, shelves, and customers. But each completed shift brought the satisfaction of returning home knowing there would be food on the table. On her way back, she often stopped by the restaurant run by the woman who had kept her promise, handing over a warm meal for dinner. The teenager, relieved, was able to attend school without carrying the entire burden of caring for her sister alone. She split her time between homework and house chores, but with much less weight on her shoulders, because the fight no longer rested solely on her. Their mother, though tired, repeated with pride that she could finally work with her head held high without fearing she might be taken away in handcuffs again. The veteran visited once more, this time with no hurry, bringing a wooden box filled with second-hand toys he had repaired himself. The little one grinned so wide it nearly brought her mother to tears again. He also handed the teenager a book of stories, saying he believed in her intelligence and hoped one day she would use her words not just to defend her mother, but to open doors for her own future. The mother thanked him, her eyes brimming, and he replied that he was only doing what he wished someone had done for him when he needed it. Before leaving, he offered one final piece of advice: never lose the courage they had shown in that courtroom, because courage, he said, was what kept a home standing even in the worst of times. His gesture was proof that there were still people willing to help without asking for anything in return. Mornings began to take on a new rhythm in the small apartment. The teenager packed her school bag while helping her mother set out their simple breakfast: slices of bread, warmed milk, and sometimes fruit sent over from the restaurant as a courtesy. The little one woke up smiling, always with her teddy bear, and rushed to sit beside them, begging her mother to tell stories as they ate. The mother, weary but grateful, smiled as she watched them prepare for the day. Fear no longer woke the family routine did. They gathered around the table not in silence, but to share the little they had, turning it into plenty. The table, once a symbol of emptiness, had become the place where their mornings began together, strengthening bonds that even the pain of the courtroom could not break. Evenings changed too. Instead of heavy silence, there were voices and small routines that repeated themselves. The little one begging to play a few minutes longer before bed, the teenager going over homework at the kitchen table, and the mother watching them both with quiet gratitude. Sometimes visitors arrived unexpectedly, like the elderly woman who appeared with a simple cake, or the veteran returning to check in on the girls and tell stories that left the youngest wide-eyed with wonder. Each gesture reminded the family that they were no longer alone. And even when hardships lingered, the burden was shared, no longer carried by the mother alone. That invisible sharing gave them strength, the certainty that, despite their scars, life was being rebuilt, and the future, at last, seemed possible. One cold Saturday night, the three of them sat at the table lit by a single dim lamp, though it seemed to shine brighter than ever. On the plain tablecloth sat fresh bread, warm milk, and a plate of rice with vegetables. No feast, just enough, but truly enough without lack. The mother watched her daughters eat peacefully and felt a lump rise in her throat. She reached for the teenager's hand, then stroked the little one's hair, whispering a promise that she would do everything in her power to never let them go through such hardship again. The girl smiled, not fully understanding the weight of her words, but feeling their warmth. Outside, the city carried on, indifferent. But inside that small apartment there was peace. And for the first time in a long while, the family fell asleep. Without fear, united by the certainty that tomorrow, though uncertain, could be faced with their heads held high. The end. So, what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.